Mustafa Barghouti is the Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative and a former Palestinian Minister of Information. He joins us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Good to have you with us. So just to put this, first of all, into a broad perspective for viewers, what do these elections mean for Palestinians in terms of birthing a new political reality that represents their aspirations, represents their rights?
I don't think they do. And unfortunately, these elections are just going to bring the same system that was there all the time. Why? Let me explain. Elections are happening now only in 183 communities out of 429. Why is that? Because 49 communities had no list whatsoever. Nobody wanted to run. And because 197 communities have only one list, which means there are no real elections happening there. So in reality, the elections are happening only in 42% of the communities.
Why is that, Mustafa? Can you just explain to viewers why is that?
I'm going to explain that, yes. That is because the Palestinian Authority imposed on candidates who want to run commitment to its political program, which is a constitutional violation of people's rights and a violation of people's right to have freedom of expression and freedom of belief. That's why many parties like ours have boycotted these elections, demanding that there will be no conditions imposed on any of the candidates who want to run. And the second reason is because people want to see the real elections, which they are still waiting for. For 20 years, we did not have legislative council elections, and we did not have presidential elections since 21 years. That's why these elections maybe are meant to show some countries in the world that there is some reform happening, but that's not true. The real reform will happen when we have separation between judiciary, executive, and legislative powers, and that can happen only if Palestinians are allowed to have presidential and legislative council
Mustafa, let me jump in and play devil's advocate from perhaps the perspective of those Fatah factions. Could they argue, well, the reason for those conditions you mentioned is that the priority in these elections is re-establishing some sense of the viability of a governing authority and a connection between Gaza and the West Bank? Do these elections at least re-establish that kind of connection between Gaza and the West Bank that we saw was undone in the events of June 2007?
That is good, because the fact that there is elections, but it's only in one place, Deir al-Balah, where only 21% are participating, and according to the results of the Central Election Commission. But why we didn't have elections in Gaza? Why we didn't have elections in the north, in Rafah? Because these areas are occupied by the Israeli army, which of course does not allow people to have normal life or normal ability to have elections. A big question here is why we didn't have elections ever in Gaza City since 1956. Why during all the years of the Palestinian Authority we didn't have elections for Gaza City? And that's why I think what we need is real elections. If you count that only 40% are voting today, in only 42% of the communities where elections are happening, then the actual participation is only 17%. And that's not what Palestinians are used to.
Will these elections, you kind of touched on this, the idea of reform, will they show reform, and will they show reform to a degree that convinces outside powers like the US, like Israel, that the PA is a viable, functioning authority that can take over some, at least, responsibilities in Gaza and move that peace deal forward? Or is that a dream, do you think?
No, they might, for some people, they might show an image of reform, but in reality, this is not reform. We can't speak about reform unless there is true democratic reform, which means free democratic elections, presidential and legislative council, and maybe for Palestinian National Council. But without these elections, we cannot speak about separation of powers. And without these elections, all the powers in the Palestinian Authority, which is also stripped from many of its powers by the occupying forces, all the powers in it are concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. And that's what is felt during these elections, that even when in some places, some lists tried to present opposition participation, they were unfortunately subjected to oppression.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much, Mustafa Barghouti from the Palestinian National Initiative, joining us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank.
Thank you.